Stare at your palm right now. Do it. Seriously observe its surface, the flesh covering it, the hue of it, that exact tint you possess all your earthly existence, which you certainly never actively picked, which you couldn't request or secure or merit. It just exists. It simply remains. Now consider a query which appears basic, yet could entirely melt your mind whenever pondered in a deep enough manner. Why is it that hue, not in a metaphysical way, in a factual, physical, anthropological way, why does your flesh appear the way it does? Why do folks from various regions of the globe exhibit such wildly distinct complexion gradients? And quite importantly, why did certain early forebears shift from incredibly dark flesh toward the sort of whiteness that causes folks to resemble blank copy paper? The truth includes sunlight, a nutrient many individuals merely care about whenever their physician rather bluntly attaches it onto their lab test sheets. A seafood-rich diet, plus one of the most profound epiphanies in all of science. Let us begin at the start. Around 300,000 years prior, the earliest fully developed Homo sapiens emerged on Earth. They appeared in Africa, and every single member of that group, without fail, had pigmentation. This isn't just a hypothesis. This is not open for discussion. DNA research, archaeological proofs, evolutionary studies, they all point toward one identical reality. The foundational condition of human skin is highly pigmented, rich brown, occasionally looking virtually black beneath specific illumination angles. And the explanation here is both fascinating and somewhat frightening. The African daylight is attempting to murder you. Not in an explosive fashion, not in a vicious fangs and talons sort of fashion, but via a silent, unseen, intense UV light mechanism. That tropical daylight beats down harshly, directly, 365 days a year. There are 0 seasons across sub-Saharan Africa the way they exist in, say, Norway. There is 0 winter pause from solar rays. There's merely the sun every single morning completely declining to take a vacation. And one of those compounds that solar radiation ruins, silently, invisibly, and with immense speed, is folate. Folate. Vitamin B9. You've likely spotted it on the back of some oatmeal package and immediately ignored reading it. Yet, folate remains one of the highly critical compounds inside your system. It's vital for genetic creation. It's necessary for cellular replication. It serves a massive function in the creation of red blood cells. And during gestation, it is completely mandatory. Should a pregnant individual's folate reserves dip excessively low, the threat of neural tube complications, issues like spina bifida, wherein the spinal cord won't seal correctly, explodes. We're discussing infant malformations so profound they might be deadly or cause a lifelong physical impairment. Miscarriages. Growth complications inside the womb. Stated differently, if intense UV is continually ruining your folate, and you're expecting or you hope to become expecting, or you simply wish to someday successfully procreate, you face a massive hurdle. Nature, as always, was never going to tolerate this flaw. Enter melanin. Melanin is the compound synthesized by unique cells termed melanocytes, and it performs something incredible. It absorbs and diffuses solar energy before it might sink deep beneath the dermis and cause destruction to your folate reserves. View it as a natural biological sunblock. The more melanin you carry, the darker your flesh, and the safer you truly stay. Under extreme UV conditions, packing abundant melanin is not simply visually striking, it provides an immediate biological survival edge. Folks carrying high melanin preserved their folate. They enjoyed safer gestations. Their offspring lived. They handed down those traits. And across tens of thousands of centuries, deep pigmentation grew, permanently embedded within human DNA across equatorial communities. It's a gorgeous mechanism, neat, functional, successful. The issue involves what occurred subsequently. Somewhere spanning 60,000 and 100,000 years back, depending on whichever genetic timeline you favor, since scholars totally enjoy bickering over this at seminars, a band of Homo sapiens departed Africa. We aren't certain exactly why. The dominant hypotheses highlight climate shifts, fluctuating food sources, demographic stress, or simply the innate human urge to stare at a horizon and wonder what could exist over there. Whatever the motivation, they departed. And they began diffusing around the planet during what researchers currently term the Grand Out of Africa Exodus, one of the most significant road trips throughout history, albeit entirely lacking roads, zero cars, and zero GPS. They migrated into the Middle East, into South Asia, toward East Asia, across Europe, and because they ventured continually farther from the equator, something regarding their environment altered completely. The daylight grew fainter, not the star itself, naturally. The sun didn't contract. But across upper latitudes, the trajectory by which rays strike the planet's ground becomes significantly flatter. That UV energy must pass across thicker atmosphere to hit the dirt, and a massive fraction of it becomes absorbed or deflected during the long journey. Across northern Europe, for example, the sun scarcely breaches the horizon throughout frosty seasons. Whole weeks might pass where adequate UV exposure remains nearly at zero. For deeply pigmented individuals who had recently migrated out of tropical Africa and begun inhabiting places like Scandinavia or the British Isles, this represented, purely biologically speaking, a looming disaster. Because here is the flip side regarding UV rays. You require some UV light. Your anatomy relies upon it. Crucially, your flesh utilizes UVB rays to generate vitamin D. Whenever UVB particles strike a molecule inside your dermis, termed 7-dehydrocholesterol, a physiological sequence turns it into pre-vitamin D3, which then becomes modified via your liver and kidneys into usable vitamin D. And vitamin D, as we now know, isn't a mere bonus. It is no optional dietary boost for folks who love spending too much inside organic grocery shops. Vitamin D controls calcium and phosphorus uptake inside your gut, which dictates how your skeleton and teeth become hardened. Lacking it, calcium inside your meals simply travels past you without getting adequately utilized. Your bodily defense network requires vitamin D pathways inside almost every defense cell. It serves a purpose for muscle capability. It helps in managing swelling. There exists proof it affects neural growth and emotional stability. And the illness triggered through intense vitamin D shortage among toddlers is rickets. Rickets is incredibly noticeable. Whenever youths cannot acquire adequate vitamin D, their skeleton literally fails to harden. They stay weak, bendy, and subsequently the pressure from the kid's own mass begins to distort them. Bent legs, twisted backs, misshapen chest cavities, which render breathing arduous, cranial deformities. Those youths suffered weakened immune barriers, unending agony, and drastically lowered probabilities of reaching full adulthood, much less flourishing. For adults, the corresponding ailment is termed osteomalacia, weakened, painful bones which break effortlessly, and seldom totally mend properly. Inside a tropical climate drenched in UV light, this remained practically a non-issue. However, across northern climates experiencing weak UV levels alongside extremely dark flesh that remained biologically tuned to reject as much UV as physically manageable, you encounter massive evolutionary friction. The protective shield that guarded your forebears across Africa now repelled the precise nutrient keeping your skeleton intact. People birthed carrying marginally less melanin, owing to chance DNA variations, managed to generate extra vitamin D amid sun-deprived zones. Their skeletons remained tougher. Their defense barriers grew far stronger. Their offspring grew healthier and reproduced at better frequencies. Across thousands of eras, those traits dispersed among Arctic communities. The highly pivotal among these variations happened inside a sequence named SLC24A5. A lone nucleotide swap, one character shifted within a 3 billion character biological script. Inside this sequence explains roughly between 25 and 38% of the complexion gap separating Caucasian and African groups currently. One shift, that's the kicker. Following hundreds of thousands of years, where natural selection optimized dark flesh for African habitats, one minuscule swap inside one sequence answers a massive portion regarding why pale Europeans appear as they do. Another huge shift inside a sequence named SLC45A2 aided quite heavily in this transition too. These changes are presumed to have proliferated among Caucasian groups with remarkable rapidity, in purely biological contexts anyway. The data indicates the dramatic bleaching of human skin across Europe occurred primarily during the previous 10,000 to 8,000 years, which leads us toward the segment of the narrative that shattered online forums. Once ancient genetic analysis became advanced enough to begin decoding the traits of prehistoric Europeans, scientists achieved a breakthrough that a shocking amount of folks considered intensely awkward. Ancient European hunter-gatherers, groups that had occupied Europe for millennia upon millennia, were heavily pigmented individuals, not somewhat tanned, not a light mocha, incredibly dark-skinned, alongside physical traits that might nowadays seem linked to demographics completely outside Europe. The widely known specimen remains Cheddar Man, discovered inside Gough's Cave throughout Somerset, England, tracing back roughly 10,000 years. He represents one highly ancient intact human skeleton, ever fully unearthed across Britain. Researchers isolated ancient genetics from his internal ear structure, studied the melanin markers, and verified Cheddar Man possessed dark to deeply brown flesh, blue or greenish eyes, plus tightly coiled hair. He was English in every substantial manner. He resided in Britain, he perished in Britain, he possesses recognized biological descendants across that exact region nowadays. Yet he resembled absolutely nothing like what typical individuals pictured whenever they visualized early Britons. The BBC published this revelation during 2018, and the reaction from specific pockets of the web was what academics could politely describe fiercely hostile. Some folks simply declined to accept it. The findings, however, have been duplicated and validated several times, utilizing numerous prehistoric remains across various European dig sites. Ancient Europe was never a landmass of light-skinned individuals. It turned into one, surprisingly recently. The quickening of this pigment loss phenomenon seems to be intimately tied toward the dawn of farming. Roughly 7,000 to 9,000 years prior, agricultural tribes originating in Anatolia, essentially modern-day Turkey, started expanding into Europe. They carried alongside them grain, crops, tamed livestock, and a totally fresh paradigm of existence. They intermingled with and across numerous regions, effectively ousted the native hunter-gatherer demographics. Thus their traits, including markers tied to paler flesh, started dispersing amidst European societies. However, here's the paradox that makes evolutionary scholars laugh grimly at conventions. Agriculture likely made severe vitamin D starvation vastly worse before our DNA adapted. Ponder about this. Foraging tribes passed their days outside, traveling continuously, subjected to whatever sunshine remained accessible. And crucially, their meals came loaded with hunted animals, seafood, crustaceans, plus internal organs, representing incredible sources of ingestible vitamin D. First agrarians? They remained at a spot. They began donning heavier garments, citing cultural and pragmatic motives. They commenced dedicating extra hours inside covered buildings milling crops, and their nutrition pivoted drastically toward grains, oats, rye, sorghum, which yield virtually zero vitamin D. Thus, you presently feature populations dwelling near frigid zones having dark flesh adapted toward tropical UV intensities, consuming a menu devoid of nutritional vitamin D, passing fewer hours outside, beneath clouds which offer meager UV light through large fractions of the annum. This becomes a formula for utter bone destruction. The evolutionary push for paler flesh within those agrarian European communities remained undeniably fierce. Not subtle or gentle, instead swift and brutal. Each generation, youths possessing paler flesh who could formulate extra vitamin D appeared observably fitter than their darker-skinned counterparts. Across some several millennia, this stark gap regarding survival plus procreation compounds into an entirely community-wide shift. Yet pause, because the narrative holds one extra turn, and it's a fantastic one. Assuming inadequate UV contact represented the primary natural driver forcing pigment loss, then you'd assume the whitest humans on Earth would truly be the populations residing amid those biomes lacking the most daylight. The Arctic, northern Canada, Alaska, Siberia. But surprisingly, the native communities inhabiting these territories, the Inuit, the Yupik, the Aleut, multiple Siberian tribes, boast flesh, which appears substantially deeper than northern Europeans, who reside at fairly comparable or even southern latitudes. Why? How could populations occupying several of the gloomiest, chilliest, extremely UV-starved zones on Earth retain somewhat pigmented flesh while totally escaping devastating vitamin D shortages? Seafood, namely greasy, oily, freezing water seafood, plus aquatic mammals, plus walrus fat. The historical meals of Arctic native populations remain remarkably abundant, with exactly the provisions which represent the greatest identified edible suppliers of vitamin D: fresh salmon, trout, cod, Arctic char, walrus liver, whale fat. One lone serving of customary polar sustenance might deliver multiple days' worth of vitamin D requirements. Whenever your menu keeps delivering every vitamin D your system demands, your dermis doesn't have to manufacture any via available daylight. There's zero shortage for evolutionary pressure to push against. The demand for paler flesh simply isn't there. It's an identical biological puzzle. Poor UV surroundings, threat of vitamin D starvation, resolved via a completely unique adaptation. Caucasians fixed this molecularly through bleaching their exterior. Polar tribes handled this nutritionally by consuming a sea's bounty of oily seafood. Identical goal, entirely distinct path. Nature truly refuses to care what trick you leverage, provided you persist long enough to procreate. There remains one extra facet regarding this that warrants discussion, albeit being highly ambiguous and fiercely contested. Certain academics have argued that romantic preferences, basically partner selection, could have additionally served a function in pushing flesh tone variations, notably among specific societies and unique cultural epochs. The theory proposes that within various societal settings, specific flesh hues could have seemed interpreted like markers of vitality, youthfulness, or hierarchical standing in manners that dictated who bred with whoever. This remains remarkably difficult to investigate, since you'd have to separate societal bias from true biological pressure. Plus, societies never deposit fossils. The evolutionary science sphere argues this vigorously, yet the truthful response remains, we aren't completely sure. What we truly grasp is that biological evolution is rarely a neat one-variable narrative. It's forever environmental stress, plus partner preference, plus mutational variance, plus demographic blending, plus a slew of other variables, all colliding continuously, in manners ensuring that scholars require multiple mugs of espresso until they articulate it concisely. And presently we land at the segment of this essay that's truly the most crucial. Pull away and examine exactly what we've just detailed. Flesh tone, the trait which has been leveraged across modern civilization to segregate communities, to categorize them, to rationalize machines of abuse and subjugation, to dictate whoever receives chances and whoever doesn't, whoever gets presumed blameless and whoever doesn't, whoever gets to simply live quietly, and whoever doesn't is practically the most trivial variance conceivable across global demographics. We are discussing a cluster of genetic tweaks. We are referencing mutations that manage the volume of pigment across the most external barrier of one's flesh. We are referencing shifts which occurred mostly completely inside the past 10 millennia of time, which within the time frame of a species that has survived spanning 300,000 years, and within the time frame of an ancestry that spans backwards millions of eras, is basically nothing. Scholars who analyze human diversity have repeatedly reached the identical conclusion. There exists vast genetic diversity inside any falsely labeled racial group than across them. Two deeply pigmented individuals originating across separate zones of Africa might seem vastly genetically dissimilar toward each other, then either of them remains toward a pale-skinned dweller near Europe. The demographics we've clustered together like categories aren't logically sound natural brackets. They represent societal classifications constructed over top of a few observable cosmetic bodily markers. The biology here isn't overly complex. It is never confusing. The diversity we witness across human features around the planet remains valid, naturally, yet it rests over top of a bedrock of overwhelmingly common genetics. We remain one lineage. We developed collectively. We splintered quite newly amid spatial separation, adjusting toward regional realities in manners which tweaked a few markers, whilst keeping the vast bulk of our DNA practically identical. Anything established directly upon all that, any ladder, any structure, any philosophy which allocated value or intellect or personhood relying on flesh hue, was established upon a misinterpretation of what flesh hue genuinely represents. Flesh hue equals environment, its geography, its solar intensity, its historical meals. It is not personality. It is not intellect. It is never value. Thus, the ensuing moment you stare at your palm, or any other's palm, here's what you're truly viewing. You're viewing a message from the past, a molecular diary of where exactly your forebears resided, what volume of daylight they absorbed, whatever they ingested, how the atmosphere above them appeared passing seasons. Assuming your ancestry endured hundreds of thousands of years alongside the equator, you acquired pigment. Phenomenal, beautiful, sun-blocking pigment, which preserved your forebears robust and reproductive amid climates that simply would have devastated whiteness. Provided your bloodline passed thousands of years amidst the bleak chills of Upper Europe ingesting cereals and severely lacking seafood, your pigment vanished, thus your dermis might capture whatever dim winter daylight remained present to transform it toward the vitamin D your skeleton so required. Provided your bloodline resided across the tundra and ingested raw salmon basically every afternoon, your biology whispered, "You know what? We're fine. Keep the darkness," and pushed onward doing so. Zero of these people engineered any of this. Not one of them decided. Some prehistoric traveler who marched past Africa 70,000 years prior, squinting toward an alien landscape, marching into a biting breeze they simply had never experienced previously, certainly wasn't pondering over pigment markers or solar radiation or vitamin D production. They were merely marching northward, since something, starvation, wonder, pragmatism, stubbornness, drove them onward. And across countless ensuing years, our planet silently, subtly, character by character within their DNA sequence, modified their lineage. The daylight molded them, the freezes stripped away their pigment, the oceans nourished them. Nature, tireless and neutral and infinitely inventive, achieved its answers. And subsequently, ages afterward, those descendants gazed upon one another across a spectrum of flesh hues which climate had shaped, and several of them concluded those distinctions signaled something innate regarding whoever appeared truly human. That conclusion was never programmed within their DNA. That conclusion remained purely their fault, and unlike DNA, choices can be altered.